Series 93-099, items 74 through 99. Dual definitions, squirrels and man's civilized mind. Our language's two most brilliant euphemisms for rats. The public world of man the collective will keep an individual physically alive as long as it is required, and will furthermore make him believe he's being likewise intellectually so supported. More definitions. Ritual. A nice name for routine. Routine. A fancy word for habit. Habit, a euphemism for brain dead. The matter of survival is a simple one. Matters otherwise, otherwise. A plain talk explanation of the heredity versus environment debate. Are you ready? You're responsible, I'm not. The market of man is not driven by originality. Thus do fads and fashion compensate. To a thinker, thoughts that aren't useful aren't fun, and thoughts that aren't fun aren't informative. Okay, explain it to us. Describe it just one more once. It is. The war against the past waged on your behalf, in fact, on everyone's behalf, whether they wish it or not. All public passions are passions of pretense, comparably speaking. One city father said to the people, "Why be mystical? All herds are going to go over the cliff soon enough anyway." Words to live by, words to die by, words to get by is what we receive. There is only one kind of acceptable habit to a thinker. Ever-changing habit. Note regarding simplicity at all. There's a difference between being confused and being more complex. Additional notation. Being more complex always entails being able to count beyond 3, much less 2. 2 modes of travel are possible: public transportation and private conveyance. From a private intellectual motoring view, driving in life's public lane is like living in the slow lane. Hormones get the blues. Neurons invent palates. A thinker might well look at his public life activities as a burglar does a heist, to wit. Slip up on it, be as quiet as possible, do the deed, and get the hell out. Everybody, I'm not sure we're going back over these, so I just want. A thinker might well look at his public life as a burglar does a heist. That is, slip up on it, be as quiet as possible, do the deed, and get the hell out. Everyone's credo. The ordinary, unknowingly, a thinker willfully. First we survive, then we thrive. It is natural and easy for the simple to speak simply at their level, and for the more sophisticated to talk of life in terms metaphorical. But the real trick is for the thinker to up the ante and serve up fresh explanations at a new level of directness and plainness. Civilization, the ultimate comfy food. Once a man knew a secret. He told his friends. Some heard it and some didn't. They remained friends, some of them hearing it and some of them not. When it comes to a thinker's aesthetics, it is always the fresh and more complex that exemplifies beauty. To man continually comes the confirmation that 'tis good to be as free and individualistic as possible. And yet this public assurance itself helps renders him privately captive. To a thinker, perhaps the supreme metaphor is aging. The simple have nothing to discuss. The civilized too much. Only thinkers actually run the risk of ever taking the thinking adventure too seriously. Animals can survive without speech, while man, as man, cannot without it. To say that one is hungry is not the same as being hungry, but as regards man's intellect, saying so is even greater than being so. Series 93-104-1 through 36. One day a man mused, "If I knew where my thoughts came from, I'd understand the nature of human existence." He further reflected, "And if I knew where my feelings came from, I would know the source of my thoughts." He then asked, "What's for dinner and how's the weather outside?" Is it incumbent upon me to sometimes observe that, in my humble opinion, that at times some of these are not intended to be funny? I don't know. The four explanations, the one proposed, the response thereto, and another one that includes the first two, and then a fourth one, the enigmatic one in which you must actively participate for it to ever make any sense. Men have presently come up with the idea of a physical food chain so as a prelude for what's to follow. To describe man metaphorically or symbolically is to define him as earthbound, earth-bred, born, and bound. The ticking you hear, the talking you bear, is not in your ears and not in your hair, not neath your hair. The matter of time, the center of time, is the center of everything. The center of everything, that of time. The ticking you hear, the talking you bear, is not in your ears and not neath your hair. The center of time is the center of everything, that of time. A system that is self-referring cannot be open-ended. Same with a mind. Part 2, via conversation. A system that is self-referring cannot be open-ended. Same with a mind. Don't you mean to say same with a man? All right, if you want the juvenile version. When a few certain people understand more than they actually should, they'll often pretend to understand less. Then, when most other people actually understand less than they say they do, they'll pretend they understand more. Note, as far as you know, the first group doesn't really exist. Living life as though electives are required courses makes them so. Believing man to be the wellhead of his thoughts keeps one confused and forever an undergraduate. A certain man said to life, "Couldn't you give me a better hint than you have up until now?" And life replied, "Look up." Among porcupines, sarcasm is as good as sagacity. Few bus drivers are killed by walking into the props of airplanes. A man looked at himself and said, "Who loves you?" And his mind added, "Babe." Mentally disassembling the civilized world of man is one thing, and a most delightful thing it can be. But recognizing the origin of its construction, something else altogether. And that same certain man, as his sight grew even keener, tugged at life again. "Couldn't you now be even more direct in what you tell me?" And life replied, "It could blind you." A man's physical parts can always be satisfied. His stomach quits growling, his sex stops throbbing, his eyes no longer plead for sleep. But his mind contented? Never. The thinker has only one obligation to life, and that's not to life, but to himself. The obligation to stay alert. Everyone else wants to know where man goes when he dies. I think it wants to know where we came from, and I do not mean physically. The hazard is that the name of a system will become the system. In his mind, a man thought, if I did not talk to myself, who would? And in his body, he felt the warmth and the light. To say I is a galactic insult. A traveling thinker thought, yeah, less than 100 million miles, I see. Men on drugs can be frightened by fleas. Far from home, all men are on drugs. Mozart is to rock and roll as symbolism is to allegory. Man, the unique creature that is mental man, has a source that is not invisible and metaphysical, but is in fact quite physical and visible. Those who know that it's who you know that really counts tell others that it's who you are that really matters. You can be mental while still not being conscious. Solids ache, gases not. Solids are great pretenders, such as in them pretending to be solid. No matter what explanation everyone else currently accepts a thinker should think, we can surely do better than that. All life lives by the seasons. The more mental you are, the more you live by the clock. What minds recognize the source of time and thus of neural reality itself? If you think just of words, you won't think of thinking. You'll ponder the goods, but never production. Entertain earth at the expense of Saul. Mentally, man is a medium, not an agent. Intellectual trollers tip. With your line in the water, the boat moves too fast. Contemplation, meditation, study, and the like are all beaches. To understand is to tan. No matter what you're aiming for, it's always a straight shot to the center. Soothsaying resoothed. When man's on a roll, it's not just man on a roll. It's the whole solar system. Everyone asks, why do I think as I do? But who ponders, why do men think? That the speed of light is a measuring device should give real thinkers a clue. When it comes to the matter of direct sight, does no one find it interesting that mirrors are part of telescopes? After that, I'm going to reread the first one again. One day a man mused, if I knew where my thoughts came from, I'd understand the nature of human existence. And further reflected, if I knew where my feelings came from, I'd know the source of my thoughts. He then asked, what's for dinner and what's the weather outside? I know she didn't laugh as much this time, which I guess there are at least multiple possible explanations. Men have presently come up with the idea of a physical food chain as a prelude for what's to follow. What do you think? Does anybody want to touch that? Does anybody want to touch any of them tonight? All right, I'll ask you rhetorically or dramatically. What in the hell could follow? I mean, If that makes any sense. The idea of a physical food chain, which is obvious to everyone, the existence thereof. To call that a prelude to something additional, what else additional? I mean, if you've got a food chain that everything is connected, dependent physically, the survival level, physically, that everything on this planet is dependent upon something else, up and down a line. What in the world could be beyond that? What could follow that? What could be collateral to that? It doesn't cost anything. You can all do that too and go, like, well, that's interesting. What? Well, jump out a turn. One toward the end that said that everyone asks, why do I think as I do? But who ponders, why do men think? I'm trying not to talk tonight. I'm trying not to talk about any of these. I guess I should take back that first batch and talk about them. Everyone wonders why they think as they do. Men who consider themselves at some particular time philosophically bent, if not scrunched over. They will even ask, why do men, why does humanity think as it does? Why does some group think as they do? That is running throughout all of history, all of art, all of human conversation. Of course, the simple will still oftentimes describe it or discuss it on the basis of behavior. But that is very simplistic and probably of no great consequence to you people. Because even if you're talking about the uncivilized behavior of some person or some group of people, then if you or yourself are just a bit civilized, someone can jog the conversation over to, well, you got to understand their background. You've got to understand how they've been oppressed. You've got to understand the mentation of Group X. So it gets to, why do they think as they do? And then when it gets into very specific areas, we've got, as always, psychology, psychiatry, all of the human problems, which nowadays amount to, by and large, psychological problems, not survival problems. If you're not sick, then the problem you have is this, thinking problem. And everyone says, why do I think as I do? Why do I think in a hostile manner? Why do I think in a prejudicial manner? Why do I think in a self-pitying manner? Why do I think in a manner that gives me the blues just to think about it? Why do I do that? You do see. Philosophy, religion, art, everyday conversation. Men are continually asking that. Why do I think as I do? When have you ever, whoever, seriously asks the question or ponders the question, why do men think? Not why do men think as they do? Why do men think? I guess the answer is no one ever considers that because no one sees that it has an answer. No one sees that the question would have any pertinence. Think what a great distraction that is. Think about if you're having to, would you like to go back to the food chain? What if you are a worm in the land of birds? How often are you going to have the time, much less the inclination, or vice versa, to ask yourself, why do birds think as they do? So you'd never even get around to, well, why do worms think as they do? In case you thought that was where it should have started. No. If you're part of a food chain, which everything is physically, you are continually trying to survive. Anything you do beyond that is a hobby. Anything you do beyond that is, by its own definition, non-survival in nature. But if you're still having to fight that constant battle, how are you ever going to get around to saying, well, why do men think? Why do worms think? You stay, all ordinary people, stay somewhere else in this imaginary subsequent food chain of some other type that we won't go into. But you stay somewhere off of yourself. You don't ask, men do not ask, why do we think? They want to know, why do I think as I do? But they think as they do on the basis that they are worms surrounded by birds. I must think to protect myself. I must think to counteract what other people are thinking. I must, at least in my mind, think certain words to respond to the unkind words, the unfair words that others think and say to me. I must think in a certain way, in certain ways, to survive. I must think in certain ways to protect my religious heritage, my nationalistic heritage, myself. And if someone else goes by in a car and hollers, "Screw you," then I must say out loud, or according to how big they look or how drunk, whether I say it out loud, at least to myself, I say, "Well, screw you too." If someone says the whole world should be Buddhist, and to yourself, if you're surrounded by people with shaved heads and in a certain environment, you might say to yourself, being a Hindu, you might go, "No, I think we should be Hindu, but I'm just not going to press the matter." You must think in a certain way. But no one asks, why do men think? You never get around to it. Even if I could, in some way, make it seem as though an ordinary person might benefit, their feeling, even if they saw toward what I was pointing, they would never seem to have the time, because they must continually think, why is my environment? Why do birds think like birds? Why is life always nipping at me? Why am I always nipping at me? Why do I keep having thoughts that seem to be unprofitable to me? If you could get to the question, why do men think, on your own, if you got to the actual question and it had some meaning to you at the time, would that not change the whole complexion of why do men think as they do? Why do you think as you do? If you went beyond all that, just why do men think? All right. To describe man metaphorically or symbolically is to define him as earthbound, earth-bred, born, and bound. As long as you describe man, as long as you think about man having to think in a certain way and wonder why, and in fact consider, as you should if you're ordinary, to consider the question as to why I think as I do to be an extremely up-to-date, sophisticated, educated, in-depth question. To do that, you will always think of man metaphorically. And if you say, "No, I don't," then you're thinking about him symbolically. And if you say, "No, I got past that," then you're back to metaphorically. The only possible, if you want to call it potential, partial exception, is at weak moments when civilized people now think of man as close as they can to simply a physical creature, which is just a dream, because once you can think, you cannot picture yourself as a strictly physical creature. The proof being the existence of pornography, for one thing. Figure it out on your own. All right, the popularity of sports. Well, that's better. The hobby of gourmeting, dining. But as long as you think about man in that way, as long as you think about man as being something other than he is, which everything in a civilized intellectual milieu tells you that he is, be ye religious or not, man is something more than he is. If not, you'd lay down and die. So no matter what approach you try to take verbally, you're going to be speaking of man either metaphorically or symbolically. And if you just said that, and ordinary people are listening, they'd go, "Well, there's no problem." That in fact shows that we are making some progress. It shows that we are not still talking about man as though he is some non-soulful, non-intellectual, non-potentially transcendental creature. That he's not just a chimpanzee with a better IQ. That there is something more to him. That sounds on the surface, yes. How true? What progress? Except for this. If you stay there and you only describe man, you only think about man himself in terms metaphorical or symbolic, you have forever tied him to the earth. And if you think that the earth is the center of everything, then I guess we'll give you the anti-William Tell Award for the year. That will all make it a point not to stand next to you on the firing range. Doesn't that sound better? See, I was going to do a little piece of... Didn't that sound better if you were ordinary people to infer that the earth is not the center of the universe, notwithstanding Copernicus and all those other dudes? But doesn't that sound better than just to somebody go, well, to think that man's the center of the universe? Because see, if you do that, you're back symbolically, or in the symbolic, if not metaphorical, neighborhood, so that anyone can argue it in any direction they want to and stay there forever. Sounds better to speak of the planet than it does man, doesn't it? Well, would seem to be several reasons, perhaps, are worthy of some note. Is it that the planet is less easily offended? Or you figure, you can insult the planet and nothing seems to happen to you, and you insult a man and he might kick you in your umlauts. Interesting, huh? I'm skipping the obvious ones that tie this together. I read them once if you weren't listening. I'm skipping over them. Mentally disassembling the civilized world of man, the intellectual world, is one thing, and it can indeed be a very entertaining thing. But recognizing the origin of the construction is something else. Everyone asks, why do I think as I do? But who ponders, why do men think? You can become clever. You could become clever at an ordinary level and disassemble. At an ordinary level, we could just leave it as being a flashy, double-tongued critic, sarcastic smartass. And you can disassemble life. I mean, there is no aspect of human existence, from anyone's view, anything that is non-survival is in no way immune to child's play criticism. I mean, pick out what seems to be in your mind. It doesn't matter. Just your ordinary mind, what would ever be considered to be one of the most sacrosanct human institutions, human activities. Normally you'd think maybe if, at least in the past, the church, maybe the Catholic Church, maybe the king of somewhere, the ruling Politburo, if we go back 5 years, of the USSR. Well, there's something not to make fun of. Yet we've been through this. You do know that no matter how it seems to some other group of people about how formidable, how serious something is, some religious organization, some philosophical system, some idea, some theory, all you got to do is have a kid come along, somebody with an IQ of 89, a bricklayer on a drunk, which is part of the story, I submit to you, of the old fairy tale about the king doesn't have any clothes. Do you remember that one? He was such a tyrant, such a iron-fisted despot, that he could walk out nude. Of course, he had to be dumb enough to be a king to fall for it, and some tailor, sold him, nothing, charging him 5,000 rupees, and sent him out in the street naked, and nobody would say anything. They blew the trumpet and said, "Here comes His Majesty in his brand new clothes." And the whole kingdom went, "Ooh, ah." And of course, he was naked. And the story is one little kid, tugged at his mother and say, "The king don't have any clothes on." And the fairy tale and reality fell apart. Which is back to why you don't find humor in religion. It's why you do not. It's why governments have no sense of humor, and the more that the government is tyrannical, they have no sense of humor whatsoever. Not just them personally, but they do not even want it loose in the village, in the kingdom. So you can disassemble, no matter what man has invented. You can disassemble it mentally. And it can be great fun with ordinary people. That becomes the fun, is being able to stick out their tongue at the king, at the church, at the institution, without anything to follow it up with. In other words, to no intellectual ultimate benefit to themselves. Mentally, disassembling the civilized world of man is one thing, although it can be fun. But recognizing the origin of deconstruction is something else. That, may I submit to you again, is connected to everyone asks, why do I think as I do? Why is life arranged like this? And they can even begin to disassemble it. They can come up with a new twist on some psychological or sociological description of why man operates in this particular area in this particular manner. In other words, he can disassemble it. Someone can say, well, now here's what's actually going on. And it can not only be fun momentarily to the person, but he can even make a reputation. It's going on all the time. But he's saying, he's answering the question, he's responding to the question, why do men think as they do? And he's responding to the question saying, well, now here is why people are still religious in that fundamentalist manner, be they Muslims or whatever. They can say that, or here's why men will still put up with tyrannical governments. And he'll come up with some slight twist on some older explanation, psychologically, sociologically, economically based. But they never get around to the question, well, why do men think in the first place? Because that would be questioning, that would be the interest in the origins of the construction. Not why is it constructed like this? Why do we look out here and we have human institutions that from certain views, from my view or from other views, do not fulfill real needs, they cannot complete their own goals, whatever. And they can disassemble them. They can critique them in a way that seems to, in fact, be intellectual, academic, pithy. But they never get around to any other question. The question of, well, why do men think anyway? And this is simply the result of it. Not why do men think like that. Why do men think? That's the original construction. Too close to the center of this. I'm skipping that one. Wanted you to know. Everyone wants to know where man goes when he dies. A thinker wants to know where he came from. And I don't mean physically. I'll give you a hint. I hadn't changed the subject at all. But that's parenthetical because it's going to sound like we did, and that's the reason I'm using this one. If it was any closer to what I was talking about, I'd skip it. The whole world, be they religious or not, is concerned about what happens to man after he dies. Those who are not religious, at least in the Western sense, normally fall on the idea of reincarnation. Everyone is interested. You can take a man, or you can find if a man was educated, civilized, and he swore he was not religious and swore he didn't believe in reincarnation, he would still have an interest. I mean, if you ask him, you said, well, do you have, since you got no belief in ideas of Christian heaven or Islamic paradise or Buddhist state of non-being while yet being? See, well, a state of non-being, but while being aware of it. That kind. I'll leave it to them to describe. If you ask a man, he goes, yes, yes, yes. And you go, and you're not any of those. No, I'm not. And you say, well, so in other words, you don't have any interest in what happens to man after he dies. If he's educated, sophisticated, all, he's going to say, well, that's not true. I've got an interest. He'd just say, I don't buy into the stories or whatnot. Man, of course, man's genes makes him talk in certain ways. So everyone has an interest in what happens to man after he dies. And it says a thinker, on the other hand, wants to know where man came from, and I don't mean physically. Now, before we get to that part, the end part, let's go back to the first part. Ordinary men would say they're interested in what happens to them and humanity, but what happens to them especially. Humanity maybe, if I get around to it. But they're interested in what happens to them. And what do they describe insofar as what happens to them? Their theories, their questions, their belief systems, the mythology and religions they adopt. What is it all tied to? Physically. That was the answer. That wasn't part of the question. What are all descriptions in all holy books and from all the interpreters of the mainstream religions from their holy books? What's all the interpretations of the afterlife? It's all physical. That's the only thing they talk about. Whether it be the kind of guilt and debt religion like in the West or some other form, it's still on the basis they describe what might be the reward, what might be the lack of reward, but it's always on the basis of such as fundamental Western ideas. If you do not live a good life afterwards, you physically are tormented for either 5,000 years or until your first wife comes back, whichever comes first. And with all, a reward is all described on what basis? Well, again, the the Muslims are all about the same. You'll never get sick. You'll never get old. You'll never go hungry. You'll never go horny. You'll never go... It's just physically paradise. What else can you call it? Dig it. They're not listening to what happens to man physically. And yet that's all they talk about. I don't mean that they're fooling us, because you've been there yourself and you weren't fooling you. Your parents didn't try to fool you. Your rabbi or priest didn't try to fool you. But the idea that they're interested in what happens to man physically, nobody cares. Oh, they can say they care. I'm not going to get in a fist fight over it. But that's not what they're concerned about. You want to think about it a second? Can you think about without me I can drag out metaphors and allegories having to do with other creatures and other aspects of life? It's simply a fact. That is not what concerns people. If I might remind you, there have been several items recently that point out that a real thinker, a real person cannot live whatever the collective's mythology is. Put it to you another way. Whatever everybody else believes, forget it. Not because it's wrong, but look on. If everyone says, if it is, as you can surely see, without any doubt, all descriptions of afterlife are concerned specifically with the physical being of man. That's all they ever mention. Oh, they can say something like, he'll be happy. He'll never be depressed. They didn't even go that far. It's all physical. That's all they describe. Torment and reward. The possible payoffs of living a good life. The possible debts that you may have to pay later on. They're all physical. If nothing else, once you begin to see how the collective works, that should tell you something immediately. If that's what everybody believes, including me, back at the old level, then, it's got to be useless. Well, it's so lacking that it didn't get me anywhere. So, no sense being mad at it. It's like a launching pad. It's like the step to get you off the bus. The actual being of man does not care. The question, what drives all of the dreams, all of the many books, theories, rituals concerning what happens after you die, and it's all depictive, pointing to, exemplary of, in reference to the physical being, the physical life of man, that's not what it is, which is why they point at it. Now back to the second part here. Don't lose. Everyone wants to know where man goes when he dies. I mean, what we just went through. Not physically, but that's the way it appears. Everyone wants to know what happens to man when he dies. I think it wants to know where man came from, not where he's going. They want to know where he came from. Dice. And I don't mean physically. I'm not sure there's any profit in pushing this much further in that direction, but also note, I was trying to set up one side so I wouldn't have to do this side, but here goes. How about all the creation stories? All the creation stories are what? Physically based. You know, the God spit in the mud, pulled out some clay, and made man. Or pulled out of nothing their great powers and went poof, and physically there was a man. Physical, physical, physical. They don't really give a goddamn. That's not what people want to know. But they'll never realize it. Who the hell cares? What would that tell you? Because the truth is, we can tell you physically where you came from. Beth Sinai Hospital, the Bronx, 1947. Georgia Baptist Hospital, July the 14th. Mother's name. Now, I know you can say, well, that's not what I meant. I was asking, my concern's always been metaphysically, transcendentally, I want to know where I came from. Think about it. You do not care where you came from physically. I might also, since we didn't seem to be having as much success as some of us were hoping for in another direction, might I also suggest part of the popularity of science, theories of cosmology, Big Bang theories, like, boy, where'd the universe start? How did we get here? Again, it's like a distraction. I don't mean that can't be fun and interesting, but the truth is, as far as where you came from physically, that now we could get people, besides just the aspect of cosmology and theories regarding the origin of the universe, you could get people now, let's say, who are very scientifically inclined, very non-religiously motivated whatsoever, and they would say, well, my interest, if they were referring to something I was just saying, that kind of mind nowadays could say, well, I do have an interest in the origins of man, because the origins of man are tied to the origins of the universe. I just don't believe in some sort of metaphysical that the gods did so and so, but I am interested literally, all the way from the scientific to the, let's say, less scientific, the more humane view, this non-religious person could say. I am interested in both, of physically how man evolved. I like to read about the latest theories of physical evolution on this planet. You know, when they're breaking down and the theories keep being refined over the kind of gaseous conditions, all the kind of atmospheric conditions, the kind of temperature and humidity that had to be here on the planet for nitrogen and oxygen and everything to get together and the muds be just right, and man began, some creature, a sentient creature, suddenly sprang forth. I am very interested in that. No, they're not. Nobody cares where they came from physically, other than a hobby. In the same way that, boy, I'd like to know, I heard that there's a brand new theory about how the universe, where it came from. No, man might say, well, tell me. I got nothing else to do. That's the kind of interest they have in where they physically came from. That's not what people are interested in. That's not what your genes are interested in. May I refer you back to that non-identified food chain that one of the first items said might be subsequent to the physical food chain. The molecular basis of your own neurons, of everyone's nervous system that can think, does not look back, although it will say this if you ask it. It does not look back and go, God, I wonder where we came from. You go, what do you mean? Well, I mean me physically. Humanity physically. You go, oh, and you let it go. They don't care. You don't care. Other than as a passing hobby. That's not what you're interested in any more than you care what happens to you after you die, physically. That's just the one that gets everyone's attention. I'll keep you involved forever. Because physically, most people would say, if given the choice immediately, instantly, at the moment, that is annoying as psychological problems can be. You can take a person who says proudly that they have cards showing that they are, got 2 or 3 classifications of neuroses and maybe 1 semi-serious psychoses, and they can prove it. They got cards, from a doctor or somebody, and you say, boy, I bet that's horrible to have those kind of phobias and those kind. And they go, yes, yes, yes. And you say, all right, and you very quickly pull out a very sharp razor, and you put it up against their throat, and you say, all right, which would you rather have? Me to start cutting on your throat right across here, or for right now for you to suffer some of that extreme depression you say that almost debilitates you? All sane people, do we have to go any further? Given the choice right then, would probably go. Am I wrong? Would probably go. I believe I'd prefer the psychological problem. I mean, if it's down to that right at this moment, I think I'll take that. Sure they would. Sure they would. And you ask a man, if someone knew actually, not theory, but if someone actually knew what happens after you die, would you like to know? And the person goes, I certainly would. And they say, well, what if somebody knows, and there are 2 things. They know what happens to you after you die physically. You understand what I mean? Physically. You see the body lay down and rot, and just the person's gone. Yeah, I understand that. But then there's also that there was a person in there, right? It wasn't just a body. And the other person go, yes. You go, all right, this guy I know that knows, or if he knows, he can tell you one of the 2, but not both. Do you want to know what happens to you physically after you die, or non-physically? You personally. Which is it? Had you rather have extreme depression back on you right now, or me to start cutting on your throat in a slow, and may I say somewhat annoying manner? I am doing my damnedest not to say what shouldn't be said. So I'm going to try to twist it a little more, the same one. If there is real validity, which I was trying to give enough examples for you to put together the picturizations and the comparisons to see that there is. But if it be true, while your first thought would have been that people want to know what happens after they die physically, and I point out that's not it, other than just passing interest. That's not what they are interested in. They're also not interested in where did I come from physically, which is why all of the creation stories are the same as all of the stories of life after death. They're all physically based. There are no stories in widespread circulation, religiously, philosophically, mystically, that specifically have to do with the gods or some force or something happened, and these creators or creator somewhere went, well, let's see. What I want to do, and I'm not going to waste time by trying to describe it, but rather than just saying they made a human, and you understand when you read it, they meant we made something that looked just like us. We picked up clay and made it. It never mentions that. It just says we made a mind. We made an intellect in a certain way. Now, it could say that, but that would have never become the big story that the Bible is. Nobody'd remember it. You go, sentence makes sense, but what kind of story is that? A little better than I did it, a little more build-up, and all the gods got together with one great God. And, the first day he looked out, and the second day, and it builds up a little bit, and finally he goes, let there be this intellect. And it might hold your attention for a second, like, hey, that's a new one, an intellect, almost science fiction. And that was it? And that was the end of the creation chapter? You go, something is missing. Something is missing at the ordinary level, because ordinarily what the mind is wired up to do is to say that's concerned about what happens after death to you physically, which it doesn't care, which is why it will fly. It's why you'll accept it. And it's also of a little less interest, where did we come from? What is our origin physically? That's not what's of any interest. That's not what's of any profit. Where we came from is no secret physically. And of course, I don't mean just Cedars of Lebanon or the LA General Emergency Maternal Ward. Not that. Back to the food chain. Everybody knows where we came from physically. That's not in question. Is anybody to yourself doing your own part now? Like, well, where do we come from mentally? It couldn't possibly be any sort of relationship between the two. Could there? In his mind, a man thought, if I do not talk to myself, who would? And in his body, he felt the warmth and the light. May I suggest to you, since I wrote it, that is not metaphysical worth duck do. I know it sounds. And he felt the warmth and saw the light. Ah, the mystical experience. You ever been to Venice Beach?
No.
Maybe I shouldn't have picked that because some people might consider that to be a mystical experience. Have you ever been to the beach? This is, although another page connected to the one, the man saw the light in his body and felt the warmth. To say I is a galactic insult. A traveling thinker thought, less than 100 million miles, I see. Men on drugs can be frightened by sand fleas. Far from home, all men are on drugs. Man, the unique creature that is mental man, has a source that is not invisible and not metaphysical. Although everything in life, at least around this part of the universe, will tell you that's wrong, and you're prepared to accept their story. Which is why you will normally think that it should be, or it is of interest, as to what happens to you after you die physically. And that you would certainly be interested in knowing, after that was answered, where man came from, how we got to be here physically. Man, the unique creature that is mental man, has a source that is not invisible and metaphysical, and is in fact quite physical and visible. I can't believe that people pay money to study theatrics and stuff. All you do is... Maybe I have an inflated opinion of my abilities. It just seems like that's all you have to do, isn't it? At least get your job on a soap opera, won't it?
No.
You just have to hold it until the camera fades to commercial. Am I confusing that with something else? Being a philosopher? No.
No.
Solids ache, gases not. Solids are great pretenders, such as in them pretending to be solid. What could be more solid than physical death? What could be more solid than physical birth? What could be more solid than a sane man having some solid, real interest in such questions? And we're talking about serious questions. We're not talking about cheap questions like, well, how in the world could the Mets have paid $5 million for so-and-so? How in the world could such and such rebel leader believe that he can sign a peace treaty with such and such place? How can such and such people who consider themselves sane buy into a mutual fund knowing that so-and-so's involved. Those are not questions. Those are games. They might as well be on Jeopardy or something. Solids are great pretenders, such as in them pretending to be solid, such as serious questions pretending to be oftentimes two things, questions and serious. Let's try it again. Are we fading to commercial? If you think just of words, you won't think of thinking. You'll ponder the goods, but never production. Entertain earth at the expense of, I can't make out that other. No. Entertain earth at the expense of something or other. Mentally, man is a medium, not an agent. Contemplation, meditation, study, etc. are all beaches. To comprehend is to tan. No matter what you're aiming for, it's always a straight shot to the center. That the speed of light is a measuring device should give real thinkers a clue. Does no one find it interesting that mirrors are part of telescopes? The observatory is now closed.